Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Door to Door. I'm Virginia Stanley. Who's out there? Christopher, is that you?
Yes, I'm here. Good to see everyone. I'm Chris Connolly with the Library LLF team. Thrilled to be joined by a very special author. But who are you down there? Is that Lainey? Lainey, do I see you there?
Yes, it's Lainey. Hi, how are you?
We're thrilled to be here today. And I don't even know where to begin. We are just so excited and honored to have author Sue Miller with us today to talk about her forthcoming book, Monogamy. Sue Miller, this is her 13th book, her 11th novel, and it goes on sale in September. Sue Miller's first book was published by Harper and Row, right, Sue?
Right.
In
predecessor of HarperCollins, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And that was The Good Mother, and that was became an instant New York Times bestseller. And subsequent novels of yours include 3 Book of the Month Club selections. That was Family Pictures, While I Was Gone, and The Senator's Wife. They're also the author of the memoir, The Story of My Father. Numerous honors, including a Guggenheim and a Radcliffe Institute Fellowship. I could go on and on. You have graced us with so many wonderful books. That fact that you are back at HarperCollins with this new book is just an honor and a joy for us to publish. And I cannot tell you how excited we are to talk with you today about this wonderful, thought-provoking, heart-stopping, sorrowful, sad, happy, fun, beautiful, life-affirming book, Monogamy. Love it. Love this
Thank
book.
you, Virginia. Thank
So
you.
I'll
Glad
stop
to
talking and ask you.
be here also. Yeah.
So Sue, okay, let's start. We have lots of raves and love for the book from fellow readers, in-staff, librarians. You've gotten starred reviews. But first, talk about the book a little bit, Sue. Let's give the framework.
It's really concerned with 2 people mainly. Graham, who's a sort of oversized person in every single way, but a great lover of life. He's a bookseller. He loves food, loves parties, loves wine, needs people to love him, which is very important. Sort of a bigger than life guy. And then he is married to Annie, who's diminutive, who's quieter, which is not to say shy or anything, but is much more reserved, really. Her daughter, Sarah, calls her unknowable at one point in the book. They're married. They've been married for 30 years or so. It's a second marriage for both of them. Graham ruined his first marriage by just embracing the notion of all the sexual changes of the 60s and the 70s. And he had an early marriage, which was really pretty much an adolescent marriage, late adolescence, and then was over pretty easily. But they have been married for 30 years. They have a daughter together, Sarah, the one who finds her mother unknowable. Then Graham had a child by his first marriage, Lucas, who's now in his late 30s. And partly for that reason, and partly because he still loves his first wife in some way, she's very much a part of the marriage too. So there are 5 main characters. There's also, the elderly neighbor and a cat and assorted friends and so forth. But the story really sort of gets going once we know them both and they're in place with Graham's death. And that there's this whole sort of part of the book that's concerned really with Annie's grief. And then there's a part of the book that's concerned with her discovery that Graham had been unfaithful to her, and which complicates her grief enormously. I mean, she doesn't quite know what to do. She doesn't know why he was unfaithful. She knows nothing about it and can find out really nothing about it. And it makes her sort of doubt everything that she thought was secure and in place about her marriage and about her life with Graham, about who he was, who she was. And then there's a resolution of it in the end, and a sort of sense of coming to know him again through various sort of odd events that take place towards the end of the book. So it's about marriage, it's about loss, it's about families and the secrets that families keep from one another. And it's finally, I think, fairly affirmative about the ways in which people really impact each other and come to know each other, and come to know each other even after death. So that's it. That's the story.
Now you make me want to read it all over again. Except I envy people who get to read it for the first time. Do you know? You don't know what's coming. And when we've been talking about this book, we're not ruining anything by saying that there is a death and then the discovery of a betrayal, because I feel like that's
And actually, all that happens earlier on in the book. I mean, it isn't that you wait till the very end happen or something. It happens, and then the book is partially concerned with events leading up to that, and then is largely really concerned, I think, in a way, with the resolution of the feelings around those issues for all of the characters. I mean, I move around from Annie to the children too, and even to the next generation. Lucas and his wife have a baby during the course of the book, and she makes her appearance. But it would really, I think, largely for me, it got going in a wonderful way, looking at each of the characters as they learn of their father's death or their ex-husband's death, and as they respond to it, and as the way they respond to it affects I almost thought of it as, I used to love those sociograms in college, where you, in psych classes, where you have your people arranged around a circle and somebody acts and that affects this person, whose response affects these two people, whose responses affect those people. And it just ends up being this wonderful, almost like a spider's web of responses and interlocking responses, and a sort of sense of the nexus of the family, or whatever the group is that you're looking at. In my case, the family. So.
right. I thought it was interesting that when I first read it and talked about the book, I thought it said so much about Graham, that Frieda, his first wife, was still, in his life, and in sort of in their tribe. And then I thought that it said so much about him, but really I thought it said so much about Annie, his wife of 30 years, that this woman is part of the picture. Now, can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, of course, she's the part of the picture nearly from the start, which, I mean, Graham doesn't make it a condition of their marriage in any way, but it's very clear that he wants Frieda to be in there and to be part of it. He, introduces them and sort of supports the possible friendship between them. And Annie's initially not entirely eager to do this. She sees it as sort of touchy-feely and kind of a little too wacky for her. But she comes to be very good friends with Frieda. And I think knowing Frieda for her is partly a way of also knowing more about Graham. But I think her wish to include Frieda is basically a very generous one. It's very complicated, the relationship between Annie and Frieda. Particularly, I think, Frieda's feelings about it. I mean, she's still in some sense or another in love with Graham. Frieda is, and sort of speculates about when one or the other of them die, presuming she's still alive, would she and Graham ever get back together? Would Annie and she live as two old ladies together? I mean, you sort of enter her thoughts and her various conjectures about her relationships amongst the three of them, which I found very fascinating, actually. But I know people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because this is where I live, who have such relationships. And so it seemed, I haven't, but it seemed of great interest to me, actually.
Yeah, and completely plausible. Like I think that's why, I don't know, I just fell deep into this book, because I just, I found all of those characters. I found it all completely plausible. I could see it all happening based on who they were. And then I liked the inner workings of their thought process, and, how Annie could pull out a little bit from Frieda to learn more about Graham. I don't know. I just thought the whole thing was just so wonderful. I didn't want it to end, but it had to. And I just think this is a great book for book clubs.
There are a lot of things they can argue about, which I think makes a good club. But I feel as though it's partly, the book, whatever it is partly what it is, because my main interest in writing novels really is character. I mean, I like to just explore characters, see how one character affects another. And that's really a sort of old-fashioned way of writing in some ways. But I think if you do it well, you really engage readers in the complexity of personality. They worked for me too. I mean, this book took me 6 years to write. And that meant I was hanging around with these people for 6 years. Not that I wasn't glad to say goodbye, but they engaged me throughout. I mean, I did not get tired of writing about them. I liked them, and I was interested in them, and I was interested in their bad behavior as well as their goodness to each other.
Right. And we talked about this a little bit the other day, and I asked you, how did you feel when you were done with them? Were you, sort of like, ugh, enough? Or were you like, oh, I miss them?
Yeah. No, I don't miss them. I'm gone, but they served me well, and I hope I served them well. Sometimes people have asked me, even with my first book, The Good Mother, perhaps I would write a sequel, perhaps I would take up that character again. And I never have that impulse. I just want to be, they exist for me in the context of this book, and in terms of what I wanted from them in creating them. So they almost don't exist for me outside of that context. I can't imagine taking one of them up again, in other words. But I thoroughly enjoyed being with them. I mean, there are always lots of times you don't enjoy what you're writing, but because it's hard to write. But I liked, and that was very important and buoying to me during the course of these 6 years.
Is this the longest it's taken to write a book? I mean,
It is, yeah. There were sort of personal reasons that made it take somewhat longer, but I think I made a very long, well, pretty long false start to this book, about more than 100 pages. And I was writing in the voice of Annie after Graham's death. So it was a grieving voice, and it was just sort of a downer, honestly. It didn't have much energy. And so I restarted it, and I started it with Graham, who has a lot of energy and who was fun to write about and who was alive at the time I was taking him up. So I think that starting that way just gave me a lot of energy for the rest of it, and it was a good place to start because I just enjoyed it so much. It was fun, and then I could deal with what happened after he died and Annie's sorrow and so forth. But the sorrow was not a good place to begin a novel, or it didn't work for me.
Oh, I find that
there
so.
needed to be. Go ahead, Regina, sorry.
I just was going to say that I find that really interesting, and I am glad you changed it, because what I love, because there is sadness, but the book is not just, I don't want to paint it as a sorrowful book. It's life. It's a little bit of everything, and I love him. I mean, there's a great quote I want to read in a second, but the bookstore, I mean, all of us can relate, just on the publishing side alone, just like, I think I told you the other day, I just want to be in that bookstore. Do you know? You just wonderful.
He made it very nice, I think.
He did. I'd like to just read Publishers Weekly gave this a starred review. It says, a robust, character-driven examination of the inner workings of a lengthy marriage. The novel is grounded by vibrant prose, vividly portrayed secondary characters, and the resiliency of everlasting love. A spectacular, powerful return. And I love the Kirkus review. Miller's skill at depicting the intricacies of marriage, parenting, and domestic life, the atmosphere of the independent bookstore, and the pleasures of flowers, wine, and food makes this book charming and inviting in a way that is somewhat at odds with its sorrowful impetus. A thoughtful and realistic portrait of those golden people who seem to have such enviable lives. I think that quote is so perfect because it's the happiness, it's the, it's the lush color of that life that they have. And then they do seem like the it couple. Are they the it couple?
Well, they certainly have tensions in their marriage. They had tension. I mean, there's a tension with which the book starts, which is, Annie's sense of his having retreated somewhat from her. There's some sexual tension. They don't make love regularly anymore for a variety of reasons. So I think they're not by any means perfect. And she is can be sort of chilly and withdrawn a little bit, and he essentially makes up for that, but which is not to say that it's easy for them. I mean, it's easier for people around them that but there's work to do for both of them, I think, in the marriage, and they've done it pretty well. They're in a good spot, with the exception of the infidelity when Graham dies.
Oh, that
Yes, exactly.
had to happen.
Well, he's the sort of person that it sort of almost happens to, we can say. I think his need for people to just really like him a lot, and his inability to disappoint people, to hurt people's feelings, he just is kind of, in a way, vulnerable to that event, it seems to me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not actually mad at him.
That was my hope, that he could do this in the book and people would just not say, "Oh, the dirty rat," or something
Right.
like that. Although he's kind of a dirty rat, really, but that would seem a sort of a regrettable but consistent part of who he was. That was something that could, and I don't want to say happen to him, because he did it, but it did almost happen to him. I mean, he sort of backed into it in a certain way.
Yeah.
Anyhow, but to me, what is interesting to sort of try to make a person who does something not good, not forgivable, but understandable in that way. I mean, I even once had a murderer in another book that I really gave it my all to try to make it clear why he did this, and to try to evoke some sympathy for him. So I like that. I enjoy that part of writing.
Well,
And I try to make the reader more forgiving than I am, I guess, in part. And
yeah.
also try to make it more forgiving than I am by writing it. So
Gotcha. Yeah. I get that. It's well, it worked. It worked. Chris, Lainey, you guys have questions. So I know, Chris, you wanted to ask Sue a couple of questions.
Yeah, I do have a few, and one that just came to my mind hearing you, Sue, talk about character, and I'm just curious because we hear authors talk about character versus plot and how they make those decisions. And what I love about this book, the characters are so real that even small moments seem to have this like organic like momentum where anything could happen, which really drives the plot forward. But I'm curious, like when you're making these characters and writing them, how do you move through the story? Do you follow them? Do you have it plotted out? How does that work for you?
well, I knew what the story would be. I didn't quite know how I would bring Annie around at the end to the position that she gets into at the end. But I knew that it would be okay when I got there. I'd be able to do that. But it just is a matter, I think, of sort of thinking of the characters who can make this happen. And then there are various sorts of things that occur to me as I'm going along that aren't structured by me ahead of time, and that seem wonderful, sort of accidental things, that have two people speaking cross purposes. Let's say someone knows something the other one doesn't know, that the first one is trying not to let on, and yet that kind of seems happens in this case, particularly between Frieda and Annie, when Frieda mistakes a question and offers an answer that doesn't fit the question, essentially. That kind of thing almost seems accidental to me. It's sort of like, oh, I could do this, and that would be really cool. And that's quite a long scene, actually, the scene of their misunderstanding and the way it makes each of them talk to the other. So I basically knew where I wanted to go. I knew basically also who the characters would be, but I've said this before, but it's like, as I imagine it, I mean, I've never done this, but if you're online and you're sort of meeting someone for the first time and you've seen their, whatever it's called, their representation of themselves online, but it isn't until you really talk to someone that you can understand that they can be the greatest person on paper and suddenly you hear something in their voice that just repulses you, something like, I mean, so it seems to me that when I began to write the dialogue, I knew them, began to also know them more intimately and differently, and to see what I could do with them, and to sort of sense of their character was enriched over and over again when I was doing scenes between people, dialogue. I love dialogue.
And one, a scene that always comes back to me is the spreading of Graham's ashes. And I don't know if we want to reveal too much, but that's an interesting thing because, you know, these relationships aren't a straight line. And, you know, Annie does come around with Frieda, but she doesn't decide to invite her to that. And
Right.
part of
Everyone gets involved in this struggle. So it's a question of whether Frieda should be there, because she's not part of this immediate family. There are the two children. There's the present wife. And, you know, does Frieda, the first wife, who's come to everything else in the world, belong at this particular event? And it's complicated. I mean, I hope there's an open question for the reader about that. But there are various people who have various feelings, and it gets very sticky and complicated. And in fact, everyone is rescued. Someone who's sort of almost not in the circle, who is Lucas's wife, Jeanne, a French actress, actually, who's very, she sees it all very simply and clearly and takes over, makes it happen the way Lucas, her husband, would like it to happen. But there was so much input into that scene. It was really great, very interesting as a way of sort of revealing more deeply how everyone is connected and how everyone can get mad at I mean, it just was a great kind of complex mess to write about, and it goes on quite a while too. So its repercussions are there, and the sort of forgiveness of everybody is also there. That element of the book, yeah.
So speaking of outside, or I guess outside characters looking in on this marriage, you've talked about Frieda, but their kids, how do they affect or maybe serve as another outlook on this marriage?
I think they feel, I think more or less the same. No, they don't. They don't feel the same about it. I mean, I think it's very complicated for both of them. Sarah, you know, has more trouble with her mother. Lucas has sort of been rescued by Annie in a certain way in his adolescence. So he's very fond of her and has difficulty with his mother. I guess mother's the chin in this book in a certain way, because each of the kids, there's the sort of sense that I explore at a certain point where each of them would sort of like to have had the other mother, but still to have had Graham. So there's that part of it, you know. But I think their understanding of the marriage, because each of them has difficulty with his or her own mother, is a little bit different. Although they, as I say, they both feel Graham mostly at the heart of things. And their relationship is interesting too. He's quite a bit older than she is, and sort of doesn't take her in for a long time when they're young. But his feelings about her at this point are complicated. He wounds her unintentionally, Sarah, his sister, near the end of the book, which has a big impact on her too, I think. But I think they're not so different one from another. But to me, to explore those differences was really interesting. I liked them both too.
Yeah,
but Sarah, I'm sorry, Virginia.
No, you go ahead.
Sarah is the more prickly of the two, and kind of a difficult character in some ways. And she and her mother just haven't gotten along. Mother is the one that's left to her, and she's trying to do her best to be a good daughter under these circumstances, and she is being a good daughter. But there are just lingering resentments that she has. She takes up some time with her memories and her, you know, the way she felt going through her childhood. She's been a kind of unattractive girl and had a lot of difficulty kind of coming to terms with herself, and her mother was not helpful to her at critical points in her life. her small, pretty mother. Yeah. So, but I liked her, Sarah, a lot. And she's, she's coming into adulthood really at this point in life, and having some interesting things happen to her outside of the family, which are, I think, strengthening her. Anyway, she was to me, a very sympathetic character.
Yeah. It's just, for anybody who's listening, and we have our librarian friends from all over the country are watching, and some have read it and some have not. And I just, but are very much looking forward to reading it. And I just feel that everyone is in for just such a journey, with all these people, and just listening to you talk about it, because I felt like I read this book a while ago, and then, I don't know, I kept revisiting it. Just these themes, the whole mother thing, I completely forgot that, just how they wish that the other was sort of their mother. I mean, but it's also understandable. And they're really such fully fleshed out characters, and I love them. It was just a wonderful book. I'm, again, so envious of people who get to read this for the first time. I wanted to talk for a minute about, because I don't want to forget. We've gone a half an hour and we haven't talked about two things that I think would be fun to talk about. First, the audio of, we were talking about this the other day, the audiobook experience. We had a really neat conversation about that. Love you to talk about that a little bit. And also, I know we showed the jacket of Monogamy, but we also Harper is repackaging your backlist. Do we have that?
Oh, wait, here it comes. I have it. Thanks, Lainey.
So do you love?
I do. Yeah, they especially look, I don't think I've seen them all just together like this. This is great.
Yeah. It's really exciting. It's what a library to have. Really. We're so fortunate to have this, to have you. And they're gorgeous.
You, by the way. So yeah.
So so those will all be coming out, these uniform editions with the PS sections, which is some,
Right. Sort of done different things. They sort of asked of me to provide something or other about them. In some cases, I wrote an essay, and in other cases, I had, an interview about a particular book. 2 or 3 cases, I think, that seemed to me to be of interest.
Yeah, that's
so I condensed some of those for the back of the book stuff too, which
right.
was fun.
Yeah, I love our books with our PS sections, because they're, that's such rich content, and you just get sort of a. Do you want to talk a little bit about the audio? We were talking the other day about your recordings of the books.
Sure. I'm about to do it for this book starting next week. I'm sort of rereading it with the notion of the way I'm going to say it out, certain things out loud. I started doing audiobooks when I published a book about my father, which was nonfiction, which was in the first person. And I just felt I would be so uncomfortable if someone else narrated, being me, essentially. And so I asked if I could do it. And I discovered that I really loved doing it. I love this, even the interaction with the sort of director who's sitting in another room, essentially, and you're in a little enclosed booth, stopping you and saying, I think you could let yourself go emotionally more in this scene, or something like that. But I feel as though what you end up doing is some cross between reading aloud, which I love to do anyway, and acting, but you're not really acting. I mean, it's just this delightful place you sit in the middle, where you don't try to completely recreate someone's voice, let's say, or accent if you have someone speaking in a foreign accent, but you try to gesture at it with your voice. And that it's intriguing to me, and it's fun. It's really fun. So though your voice by the end of the time is just really tired, but it seems to me just such an interesting place to sit as someone conveying the book, in this, you're not acting it out. you're finding a way to read. It's
So interesting. It really is. And we were talking about on CBS Sunday Morning. There was a piece about authors and their, some authors read their own and others don't, and it's a very interesting take on how the book is brought to a different dimension, really.
yeah. And I feel that when I listen to books, that I'm taking them in a different way. I mean, I'd rather read them personally myself, but there's something you also get from listening to a book being read to you,
Yeah.
I think, which you don't get when you're reading it to yourself. You slow down to some degree because there's a speed at which you read, which lets you blip over things a little bit. When you're hearing it, you have to listen to every word and you take it in differently, I think. So
Right.
It seems to me a different, kind of they're connected to each other, obviously, but it feels different to me and I like it.
Yeah. We had talked briefly, and if you'd like to read a section from the book, not necessary if you.
I did choose one. It's very short, 4 paragraphs. And I like it because it's about Graham, really. And in 4 paragraphs, you sort of get what 2 important elements in his life mean to him. One, the bookstore, and then his initials about Annie. So it's on page 23, rather. And I'll just do it. The bookstore. It had been another part of Graham's transformation. For years after he quit graduate school, all but dissertation on a doctoral degree in English literature, he taught as an adjunct here and there in the Boston area, and finally, mostly adult education classes, all the while trying to write it. He was slow to give that up, but at some point he saw that he wasn't going to be able to write a book he'd want to read, or more important, that he'd want anyone else to read. It had felt liberating to acknowledge himself and others, to shed his painful sense of the obligation to be somehow remarkable, but it left him with the unanswered question of what to do with his life, and simultaneously the realization that working on the novel endlessly, way to avoid facing that question. As he took stock of himself, he remembered the time when he had worked at a part-time job for a year or so in a small bookstore in Harvard Square, gone now. And it seemed to him that he was most happy then, living among books, talking about books. He began to nurture the notion of a bookstore of his own. So when an uncle of his, the lone success in his brother's family, died and left him with what he described to friends as a little chunk of change, he and an older friend, Peter Aiello, who always seemed any of those chunks, more or less just lying around, bought a storefront on Auburn Street, and being that Graham would run the store with Peter as a silent partner. On the opening night of all the gin joints and towns in all the world, Annie walked in with a guy he'd sent an invitation to for reasons he couldn't later recall. And in spite of everything that seemed ladylike and elegant about her dancer's body, her grave, sober face, she also carried a kind of charge that he felt instantly. He understood it as sexual, yes, and it turned out that was apt. She told him later that she'd been fucking Jeff all that afternoon, but in the moment he imagined it as directed at him, connected to all the changes he'd made and wanted to make in his life, to who he wanted to be. And his impulse was to try to be sure she didn't somehow slip away. So.
And she doesn't.
Though she sometimes wishes she had.
Yeah, right. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have
My pleasure.
questions. Let's see. We do.
A lot of love for the new covers and book clubs. Everybody was excited to dip in for and show them all the new covers for book clubs. And
Here's a question for you, Sue. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Oh, God, I just lost again. Hold on a second.
Mhm.
2 of your this is from Barbara Ringel. 2 of your novels have been made into movies. Do you see this one as a movie possibility? And if so, is there an actor you imagine as Graham?
Peter Ustinov, but he's dead. Or I don't know. I don't know. I hadn't thought about it really. He doesn't seem it doesn't seem a very likely. Who else is there that is fat and also attractive? I don't know, and not kind of a joke. I don't see somebody easily anyhow.
I don't know. Just somebody I picture somebody bearish. Do you
Mhm.
know?
I do too, yeah. But it's hard to think of an actor roaming around now who is like that.
Hmm.
Easy
Okay.
and funny and charming and bearish and yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, acting could make someone like that. I mean, that's why they're called actors.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. That's a good one. We'll have to come back to that. We have love from Wendy Wilson Bartlett out in Cuyahoga. And Janet Lockhart says, one of my favorite characters was Jean, Lucas's wife. Did she have a real life inspiration?
No. No, she didn't. There's another French wife that I had in another story, and they're not unlike each other, actually. There's a kind of practicality that I ascribe to both of them. But they're both invented. They are. I don't know where they came from. Can't account for it.
Okay. Wendy Wilson Bartlett, again, I mentioned her before. She's our good friend in Cuyahoga. She wants to know, with all of your books, how long do the books gestate in your head before you sit down to start drafting? Fledgling authors want to know.
They do for a long time, actually. I'm someone who makes a lot of notes before I start. And I like to know, obviously not everything that's going to happen, as I was talking about before, a lot of things sort of come to me as I'm working through a scene and suddenly seem wonderful and full of possibility. But I like to know where I'm going. I like to know why I'm writing the book and sort of what I want out of it myself, what I want it to sort of feel like and say, not in so many words. So I'm always aiming at that and sort of just writing notes about the character, sort of, she could say this, she could feel that. She has once, fought with so-and-so about this. I mean, just like sort of little things that I suddenly think of. So I often have a lot of pages of notes before I even start, And then even as I go along, I write in longhand in notebooks. So I write, and that all seems pretty provisional, but I'll sort of stop as I'm writing a scene and say, somewhere in here she should, or he should, and just then go back to my scene and then try to make that happen. But there are just notes everywhere mixed up. There's also one of the things I'm interested in is sort of the spaces that people live in. So their floor plans, stuff like that, recipes. But I have a number of them. Let's see if I've got one here. Yeah, here's one, propping other things. But this is a book, a notebook, and this is a novel. And you can see what a mess it kind of is. And then underlining things that I don't want and I do want, and yeah, like that. And half of the job then is sort of typing in a rough version of that and then doing revision over that. So then I have, pages that have just scribbling all over them and around to the back. And then I do another type in version. If someone could read my handwriting, it would be nice. Although I do change some things as I'm typing, but I like to write in longhand. And I like that. And as I say, the provisional quality of it. Something typed seems like a book. It seems permanent and scary. Something written in longhand, it's not permanent. It's temporary. You don't have to take responsibility for it until you type it. So I feel as though I could work in a way that feels real to me, slowly.
Do you keep those? Are
so that is, I do know where I'm going.
You know where you're going. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's important. But then just tons of stuff, happens along the way. And I enjoy it. That's what makes me enjoy it. All those years.
Do you keep them? Do you keep those?
I do have them. Yeah, I have all of them. The Boston University has a library that has a lot of different people's work. A lot of them are actors, because the first person who organized this loved actors, and so that a lot of papers of actors of one kind or another. But I got a degree from Boston University, one of my degrees, and so they have all my papers, which is nice. Every now and then they come and just take away these boxes of things that are just littering the house, and I have more space and more space in my brain too. But they are sort of place, and they are actually, I think, available now to anyone who wants to look at them.
Oh, that's so interesting. It was so cool to see that. Oh, thank you for sharing that. And lots of comments here. Loved hearing about your process and knowing the why. Makes perfect sense. Wendy Wilson Bartlett says you should be teaching workshops on character. Makes me happy. Messy. Also, Wendy Wilson Bartlett says that John Lithgow isn't fat, but he'd do Graham justice.
It's possible, yeah. Sort of porky as Winston Churchill, after all. We remember that.
Oh my God, wasn't he so good? Oh my God, that was transformative. What else, Chris Laney? We have more questions in the chat room.
Yeah, but I do just because I'm selfish and want to ask a question myself. Because I loved Annie's passages talking about her photography and her process and her, her creative just mindset there. What does her being a photographer do for the story? What does it say about her, and how did you arrive at that decision?
Well, I feel as though it sort of gives her a way of looking at and being with people. She's a little bit defended, and the camera is a way of sort of holding herself a little bit away from people, and it's also a way of giving. It gives her a role to have with people. The photographer, and that she's a little shy, so that not with her friends and so forth, but it gives her a way to be in the world, and a way of looking at people, and a way of engaging with people, which she sometimes feels is very false. I mean, she sort of retreats from that also, and is angry at herself for staying separate from people in the way that being a photographer allows her to do, and having this sort of performative part of it, which is being the photographer and behaving as the photographer and so forth. So to me, to expand the sense of her personality, and and she sees herself clearly and resists herself, doesn't like herself for part of that, I think. And so to sort of talk about her complexity as a character in terms of trying to have a life separate from Graham that means something to her, but it doesn't always make her comfortable. And I read, it's really interesting. I read about Vivian Mayer. Do you know her? She was a secret photographer, and her work wasn't discovered till after she was sort of lived as a nanny for a lot of people. But she's very interesting work. And there was a wonderful biography of Diane Arbus, which I read thoroughly. Who must have been the most crazy, wild person in the universe. And then Sally Mann wrote an autobiography that was helpful to me. And I have a friend here in Cambridge who's a wonderful photographer. And we talked a lot about her processes and the way it felt to be a woman photographer at a certain point in time. So those elements were all things I used and thought about as I was making Annie. I recommend Vivian Mayer's work to you. Anyway,
I will check it out. Yeah, I found that the whole dichotomy of observer, observed, and participant versus an observer, it just was really fascinating. And I figured you were a photographer just based on how fleshed out it was. It was really just fascinating, and I think played towards her character perfectly. So
good
for that. Let's see, Jennifer Winberry, our friend Jennifer Winberry says, do you ever get ideas for scenes or dialogue that you really love and then try to fit it into the narrative somehow?
I don't, say it again. Could you read
Sure.
it again?
Yeah. So I think once you start a story and you said you know where things are going, do you ever get ideas for scenes or dialogue that you really love, maybe separate from the story, and then you try to fit it into the narrative somehow? Or does everything kind of come in one thought
Mostly that's the
process?
way I work, but
Yeah.
sometimes they don't fit in. I mean, there's a lot of discarded material in these little notebooks too. They just don't, and certainly I think they're probably, because of my great false start to this book, I think there are probably, 150 or so pages that didn't make it in to the book that I wrote and just couldn't, they no longer worked at a certain point. So yes, it just sort of, some scenes, some bits of some confrontations or discussions between people seem very interesting. And I write them down. And then, as I'm sort of working with the narrative, they don't work sometimes. Lots of times they do, I'm glad to say, but sometimes they don't. Yeah, which is painful. But.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear your process and how and how they all come together. Well, is there anything that you want to make sure that people know before we sort of wrap things up? We've been talking for almost an hour, and it could go on because it's just so lovely to hear you talk about your book and to share this with so many people who are watching. Is there anything anything else you want to make sure people know, Sue?
I feel we've covered the territory, really. So, and thank you. Thank you, all three of us. It was great.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Again, it's such an honor to be the house that publishes this book. And full circle with coming back full circle with your first book and now Monogamy.
We
So
hope it's not my last, but who knows?
better not be.
Anyway, thanks so much. And it's been wonderful to talk about this. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you for writing it. And thank you for talking with us today. And take good care, everyone. Monogamy goes on sale September 8th. And we hope that you read it, and we know that you'll enjoy it just as much as we all did. So take good care, all. And we'll see you next time.
Yes.
Thanks, Sue.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.